The morning fog clung to the windshield like a veil of doubt, but Samantha's hands gripped the steering wheel with resolve. That rusty old Beetle wasn't just a car. It was her only ticket to a future she refused to give up on. Every bump on the road rattled the frame and echoed through her chest. Her breath fogged up the glass as she whispered affirmations.
Hello, I'm going to tell you this incredible story. Remember that to receive new stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notification bell. Let's get to the rest of the story.
Trying to silence the fear clawing at her hope. This wasn't just about her. It never was. She wasn't heading to just any interview. This was the one, the kind that people pray for. Behind her calm eyes lived the weight of dozens of small hearts. The children from the orphanage who saw her as their anchor in a stormy world. They didn't know she hadn't paid rent in 2 months. They didn't see how she skipped dinners to stretch every penny. To them, she was unshakable, and she fought every day to keep it that way. Then, as if fate itself wanted to test her limits, the engine coughed and died. Silence felt like a judgment. Her heart sank faster than the RPMs. There she was, on a forgotten stretch of road. No one in sight. Hope leaking from her eyes, just like the oil beneath the car. Her hands trembled as she slammed the door shut and stepped out into the chill. This couldn't be happening. Not today. She kicked the front tire with a mix of fury and desperation. Her polished shoes, now dusted with gravel, looked out of place in this mechanical tragedy. She stood alone on the shoulder of the road, staring at a future unraveling in real time. She tried calling a ride. No signal. Tried praying. Only silence. Sometimes, even the strongest hearts feel too tired to believe. But that's usually when real stories begin. Out of nowhere, headlights cut through the mist. A black SUV approached slowly, like a question waiting to be asked. Her instincts sparked with caution, but her heart, always open, waited with cautious hope. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Not with arrogance, but with quiet concern. No logos, no chauffeur, no name tag. Just a stranger with soft eyes and a coat, still holding the city's chill. She hesitated. Helping hands don't always come without a price. But this one offered nothing but presence. No questions, no judgment. He helped push the car to the roadside, the silence between them saying more than words ever could. When he asked where she was heading, her answer came not from panic, but purpose. An interview. For a job. For the kids. For something bigger than herself. She didn't know his name. Didn't ask. He listened as she spoke. Not just of job titles, but of dreams, fears, and children who wrote letters to Santa asking for socks. He nodded with interest, not pity. Then, just as quietly as he arrived, he offered her a ride. She didn't know it yet, but that short drive would shift the gears of everything she thought she knew about fate, chance, and who's really watching when you refuse to give up. Nathan rarely drove alone. CEOs don't just stroll around in traffic. They're chauffeured, scheduled, shielded. But something in him craved the silence that morning, the chance to feel the city without the usual filters. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was restlessness. Either way, he turned left instead of right, and that simple choice unraveled something extraordinary. When he saw the old Beetle on the shoulder and the woman standing beside it, something made him slow down. Not just curiosity, there was a sense of urgency in the air, the kind you don't ignore. Her posture said panic, but her eyes said purpose. He parked, stepped out, and asked if she was all right. No security guard, no introduction, just a man in a suit and a soul quietly listening. As they pushed the car together, her story began to pour out. Not in a rehearsed pitch, but in raw fragments of truth. She spoke of the orphanage like someone speaks of home. She didn't need sympathy. She needed a door to open. And Nathan, though he didn't say much, heard every word behind her words. This wasn't just an emotional story. It was a real story in motion. He asked where she needed to go, and when she mentioned the company name, he nearly smiled. His company. But he said nothing. It wasn't the moment to reveal anything. He offered her a ride, and she accepted, still thinking he was just another kind stranger. But for Nathan, This wasn't just a drive. It was a front row seat to a touching story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about hiring, about purpose, about himself. Inside the SUV, the silence between them was sacred. She looked out the window, rehearsing answers, while he looked at her and saw something rare: fire without ego, faith without desperation. He'd spent years building empires, streamlining resumes, scaling efficiency. Yet none of it prepared him for a woman whose resume lived in her actions, not in her words. When they arrived at the tall, mirrored building, she thanked him with a smile that somehow carried both fear and faith. He didn't say good luck. He just watched as she stepped inside, her confidence barely masking the storm within. He waited a moment longer, parked nearby, and made a quiet call. "Tell HR to let me observe today's candidates. There's someone I want to see." He stayed out of sight, blending into the shadows of frosted glass and reflection. It was no longer about hiring a new employee. Something bigger was unfolding. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness was the ignition to a chain of events that would change not just his company, but his entire life. The elevator chimed with a sterile ding as Samantha stepped into the heart of the corporate machine. Walls of glass and chrome surrounded her like a frozen ocean, polished, reflective, but cold. The receptionist didn't look up. The waiting area was silent, filled with neatly dressed candidates who oozed practice confidence. She sat down, still catching her breath, her hands trembling just enough to remind her what was at stake. Her clothes, creased from the car trouble, suddenly felt like a spotlight on everything she lacked. No designer bag, no rehearsed swagger, just conviction wrapped in thrift. As she waited for her name to be called, self-doubt tried to sneak in, whispering cruel things. But she glanced at her phone screen, a photo of the kids at the orphanage, smiling. That was her anchor. That was her why. When her turn came, she walked in with her chin high, but her heart thudding like a drum. 3 faces behind a desk glanced up and down, measuring her against a standard she knew she didn't match. "Tell us about yourself," one of them said without even smiling. No handshake, no warmth, just the script. But Samantha didn't flinch. She didn't memorize answers. She lived them. She talked about leadership, not from books, but from midnight calls when a child woke up crying. She explained logistics, not with spreadsheets, but with stories of food drives, flea markets, and impossible rent payments she somehow stretched. There was no polish, just passion. At first, they blinked. Then they listened. Slowly, her truth began to melt their rehearsed indifference. One of the interviewers leaned forward, asking about her vision. That's when her voice changed. She described the orphanage as more than a cause. It was a promise. A promise she'd made to children who had no one else. And with every sentence, the air shifted. They weren't just hearing a candidate anymore. They were witnessing a movement, wrapped in a woman who refused to quit. Behind the mirror glass, Nathan stood with arms crossed, heart pounding. He'd seen presentations that moved millions, but nothing like this. There was no projection, just purpose. No manipulation, just mission. And in that moment, he realized what most companies miss. The best people aren't always the best dressed. They're the ones who carry something too rare to list on LinkedIn. She stepped out of the room without knowing what just happened behind the scenes. Her hands were cold, but her spirit burned with a quiet defiance. She didn't know if they would hire her. She didn't even know if they truly understood. But as she walked past the reception again, something in her posture had changed. Like a storm had passed and left a fire behind. Nathan stood motionless behind the glass, his reflection barely visible beneath the room's glow. He'd sat through hundreds of interviews, heard thousands of stories, but none like this. Samantha hadn't pitched herself. She had poured her soul. No marketing buzzwords. No desperate tactics. Just a quiet storm of purpose that demanded to be heard. He didn't move as the room emptied. He just stared at the chair where she had sat, still feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't about skill sets or KPIs anymore. It was about the heartbeat behind the resume, the invisible things that make someone irreplaceable. And in that heartbeat, he heard something ancient, real leadership. Nathan picked up the phone and dialed HR. His voice was calm, but there was urgency underneath. Offer her the position, he said. Don't wait for the panel to decide. It wasn't about charity. He hated that word. This wasn't a favor. It was recognition. Because people like her didn't come around often. And when they did, you didn't hesitate. As he sat down at his desk, he pulled up her file again. Basic qualifications, minimal experience in corporate environments. But in his mind, none of it mattered. What mattered was the orphanage, the raw truth in her voice, the fire that didn't dim even when every eye in that room seemed cold. She had what companies wrote about in mission statements, but rarely found in practice. His thoughts spiraled into something deeper than business. Why had this moment stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years? Maybe it was the way she never asked for help, only the chance to prove herself. Maybe it was how her eyes never flickered with entitlement. Just grit. Whatever it was, it reached into places he thought long closed. Nathan began pacing, his mind weaving through old regrets. He remembered a time when he too worked for something bigger than profit, before the boardrooms, before the suits. Maybe that's why Samantha's story hit him like a mirror. She reminded him of who he once was and who he might still be if he dared to believe again. He didn't know where this path would lead. He just knew that offering her a job wasn't enough. There was more to unlock here, something unfolding that couldn't be explained in numbers. And though he didn't admit it out loud, somewhere in the spaces between admiration and something more, a seed was quietly beginning to grow. The job offer came in a plain envelope, but what it carried was anything but ordinary. Samantha held it in her hands, blinking back disbelief. Not only was she hired, she would be mentored directly by the CEO. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that maybe, just maybe, her story was being heard. She hadn't just gotten a job, she'd been seen. Her arrival at the company stirred quiet waves. Colleagues noticed the woman with kind eyes and a spine of steel. She didn't speak loudly in meetings, but when she did, people listened. There was something grounding about her presence, something that cut through the noise of egos and politics. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply showing up with truth. Nathan began to check in more often. At first, it was all business, strategy reviews, feedback sessions. But slowly, their conversations began to stretch. He'd ask her about the orphanage, and she'd ask him about the company's origins. They laughed more than expected, listened more than required. There was a softness forming between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Her influence spread like light through cracks. Teams became more collaborative. Deadlines were met with purpose, not pressure. Even those who were skeptical at first began to lean in. They saw that Samantha didn't need a title to lead. She led by how she lived. And in that, she became the pulse of something new inside the company. Outside the office, things began to shift too. Nathan visited the orphanage with her one weekend and left silent. The peeling paint, the crumbling stairs, he'd never seen poverty so close. But more than that, he saw how the children looked at her, like she was the sun, and something inside him broke open, not in sadness, but in realization. Within months, Nathan funded a full renovation. What was once a struggling center became a shining beacon of hope. New classrooms, fresh meals, laughter echoing through halls that once echoed with silence. But this wasn't a donation, it was a declaration, a promise that this real story wouldn't end with one act of kindness. It was only beginning, and as the orphanage transformed, so did they. There were still no declarations of love, just long glances, shared coffee, and the kind of silence that says everything. Yet underneath it all, a current was building. A partnership born not from romance first, but from shared mission. And like all great emotional stories, something deeper waited just around the bend. It wasn't one moment that changed everything. It was 1,000 quiet ones. The morning she found a coffee waiting on her desk. The night he called just to say, "You were right." The way they started walking to meetings side by side, without noticing. Love didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like sunrise, slow, certain, impossible to ignore. Eventually, Nathan asked her to dinner, not as a CEO, not as a mentor, but as a man who had fallen in love. And Samantha, who had always carried the weight of others, let herself be held, for once, without needing to hold anyone else. Their first kiss wasn't dramatic. It was simple, soft, and full of unsaid things. The kind of kiss that speaks of home. They married a year later in a small ceremony at the orphanage that started it all. The children ran barefoot, giggling through the garden, while the board of directors awkwardly dabbed away tears. There were no press releases, no luxury magazine spreads, just people, purpose, and love. And beneath the vows, a deeper promise was made, to build something that outlived them both. Together, they founded a foundation that redefined what giving back could look like. Not just charity, but opportunity. Not just aid, but empowerment. They launched mentorship programs, opened new homes in other states, and trained former orphans to become leaders of their own communities. Their impact wasn't a ripple. It was a wave. Nathan often said that Samantha taught him how to feel again. She claimed he showed her how to dream bigger. But those who knew their story, those who walked through the halls of the orphanage, understood the truth. This wasn't just a love story. It was a revolution disguised as romance. A touching story written by two people who chose purpose over comfort. Every child who entered those buildings carried a piece of their legacy. Each smile, each graduation, each healed heart became a new page in their real story. And while the world may have seen them as a power couple, they always saw themselves as students, forever learning from the courage of the small hands they held. Their love wasn't the end. It was the beginning of many beginnings. And sometimes on quiet mornings, Samantha would still drive that same rusty Beetle, restored now, but left just weathered enough to remember. Because some journeys should never be forgotten, especially the ones that begin when everything seems lost, only to lead to everything that truly matters. What would you have done in her place? Would you have given up when the car broke down, or kept walking toward your dream, no matter how hopeless it looked? And what if the person who helped you was hiding something too? Something that could change your life forever? Have you ever met someone who felt like they were sent by fate at exactly the right time? Tell us in the comments. Your story might inspire someone who's standing at a crossroads right now. If this emotional story touched you, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that prove even the smallest moment can lead to something extraordinary. And of course, tap the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next, because the next story might just be yours.